Hey, welcome everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge and I'm the convener of this webinar series for the International Social Capital Association. The association's mission is to advance the research and application of the social capital concept, and everyone is welcome to become a member now. Check out our website for further details. In this session, we welcome Associate Professor Florian Grisel from the University of Oxford for a presentation about cancelling disputes, how social capital affects the arbitration of disputes on Wikipedia. Florian is a research fellow at the French National Centre for Scientific Research and senior research associate at the University of Oxford in the Centre for Socio-Legal Studies. Using a methodological approach combining archival research, interviews, and ethnographic work, his research explores the emergence of law beyond the state in global and local settings. I invited him to give this webinar after reading his paper in Law and Social Inquiry. So we're delighted that you've agreed to give this webinar, and over to you for the presentation.
Thank you very much, Tristan. I'm very pleased to be here today, and I must apologize that last time I had to postpone the webinar. I mean, this was for health reasons, but I apologize to the audience and to you. I'm very pleased to be here today and to present this paper, which I titled Cancelling Disputes, How Social Capital Affects the Arbitration of Disputes on Wikipedia. And just to be clear, I'm not a specialist of social capital and I'm not a specialist of Wikipedia. But when I started my research, or when I chose to initiate my research on Wikipedia, I was working on international arbitration, and I presented my work at a conference in the US. And during the cocktail party, one of the attendees came to me and presented himself as a member of the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the foundation that oversees all the Wikipedia projects around the world. And this man told me about an arbitration system that existed on Wikipedia. And he told me that as everything on Wikipedia, the activities of this arbitration system are well documented and available. So I got interested in this arbitration system, and I will tell you more about what made me interested in this arbitration system. But before I do so, I will give you a brief outline of my presentation today. I will start by giving you some insights on the organization of Wikipedia, casting it as what I call a collaborative anarchy. Then I will give you some explanation of what this arbitration system that I described is about. It is called the Arbitration Committee, and I will give you a little bit of background on this Arbitration Committee. I will say a few words, not too many, but a few words on research design. Then I will present a couple of theories of social capital, and that's where probably this audience will have the strongest interest in. Then some quantitative data that I gathered, interviews that I gathered, and finally findings on what I call social capital on trial. Now, let me start with some background information on Wikipedia. You all know Wikipedia. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, use it on a daily basis. Before I say more about Wikipedia, I should specify that I'm talking here about the English Wikipedia, which is the largest and the oldest version of Wikipedia. But of course, there are many other versions of Wikipedia. There is a German Wikipedia, there is a French Wikipedia, a Spanish Wikipedia. Today, I will be speaking about the English Wikipedia. Why is it important? It is because each version of Wikipedia has its own version, its own organization, and slightly different norms. So today I'll be speaking about the English Wikipedia. The English Wikipedia is an enormous encyclopedia. I mean, you all know that, more than 6 million pages, about a billion edits, more than 1 million registered users. But what we often ignore as users of Wikipedia is the kind of work that happens behind the scenes. And so Wikipedia is not only this enormous encyclopedia, it is also a social network that operates according to certain norms. It is an encyclopedia that, unlike other traditional encyclopedias, is based on the work of non-experts. So if you read the Encyclopedia Britannica, for instance, I mean, no one does anymore, but if you were to go to a library and read Encyclopedia Britannica, you would see entries that are written by experts in the field, typically chaired professors in a university, and this person would be responsible for the entry in this encyclopedia. On Wikipedia, of course, it doesn't happen that way. Anyone can edit. That's the motto of the network, and the pages are the result of a collaborative work between non-experts who are placed on a kind of equal level. So there is no hierarchy on Wikipedia. There is a very strong norm of equality and collaboration. And this is what makes it such an interesting space to study from a sociological standpoint. Of course, this is an egalitarian and collaborative space, but as in any social space, disagreements arise. And disagreements, in fact, are quite normal on Wikipedia. They are unavoidable because people discuss the content of the pages of the encyclopedia. And sometimes they disagree, which is quite natural. They disagree, I don't know, on a fact, on an event, on the interpretation of a study, and so on. But these disputes concerning the content of the encyclopedia are to be resolved through community discussions. In other words, there is no authority on Wikipedia that is setting the truth or the right version of the content that is to be incorporated on Wikipedia. So really, it is, again, a collaborative process in trying to sort out disagreements. But as this process unfolds, very often, Wikipedia editors exchange bad words. They start insulting each other, or they start saying things that can be deemed to be hurtful or inappropriate. And they have a duty to engage in good faith during these discussions, but very often there are issues arising from conduct in the discussion of content. And that's what I will be looking at today, these disputes about conduct. When one editor is discussing with another one and is basically saying something that is inappropriate, it can be something that is sexist, it can be something that is deemed to be inaccurate, or so on. These disputes are dealt with slightly differently from the content disputes. They're first escalated to a notice board, and this notice board is basically a place for community discussion. So on this notice board, Wikipedia editors will discuss the conduct that led to a dispute, and they will try to sort it out. And this notice board is a place where disputes can drag on for years, and there's so many of them. It's a huge space with millions and millions of interactions on the many disputes that arise in the creation of the online encyclopedia. But sometimes the community doesn't achieve to solve those disputes. And in that situation, for the most important disputes, there is a kind of tribunal, there is a kind of entity in charge of deciding what should be done. And this entity is called the Arbitration Committee, and that's what I will look into. So let me say a few words about the Arbitration Committee. It was created in 2003, 2004, so at the very beginnings of Wikipedia by one of Wikipedia's co-founders, Jimmy Wales, because precisely some disputes could not be dealt with organically through discussions. And The Arbitration Committee, if you remember correctly, goes against the egalitarian ethos of Wikipedia. It is an element of hierarchy in an otherwise egalitarian space. Members of the Arbitration Committee are elected by the community. They're elected for 3 years. There are 15 of them, and the elections are held by tranche every year in December. So you have 15 members of the Arbitration Committee who are editors elected by their peers, who are in charge of making decisions. So it is a final binding decision maker. So the higher level of decision maker, a bit like a Supreme Court in a legal system. The decision of the Arbitration Committee are binding, and these decisions only concern, and this is very important, serious conduct disputes. So it means, for instance, that the Arbitration Committee cannot decide disputes concerning content. So the Arbitration Committee cannot say Donald Trump was born in year X. This is the work of the community to agree on the content. However, if there are serious conduct disputes arising in the work of these editors, the Arbitration Committee is entitled to decide these serious disputes. They have to be serious if the community has been unable to resolve those disputes. So it is really a last instance decision maker for conduct disputes that the community has been unable to resolve. So now I got interested in this arbitration committee because, as I said, I worked for almost a decade on international arbitration, which is a totally different animal, by the way, but that prompted my interest in this arbitration committee. So I designed a kind of research method that is inductive because I had a very broad interest, but I didn't really know what I wanted to test. So I started by discussing with an insider, with a member of the trust and safety team of the Wikimedia Foundation. And I had several open-ended discussions where I tried to educate myself on the organization and governance of Wikipedia. And still today, I think there is so much that I can learn because it's a very complex environment. And on the arbitration committee, trying to understand how it operates, the difficulties that it faces, the kind of disputes that it decides, and so on. Then I moved on to, with the help of a research assistant, review and code all the cases that have been decided by the arbitration committee between February 2004 and June 2020. So we're talking here about the population of 524 cases, which is quite large. And these cases deal with conduct issues. And there are some cases that are quite famous on Wikipedia. These are cases that, of course, are probably for some irrelevant for the outside world, but they have great importance for the social space of Wikipedia. And then as a last step, when I could identify more narrowly what I was interested in, I carried out a series of semi-structured interviews with 28 members of the arbitration committee, parties, disputing parties before the arbitration committee, and Wikipedia editors who either had a long-standing experience on Wikipedia or had been involved in these disputes as well. And I will say a little more about the ways in which they have been involved in these disputes. Now, what interested me progressively, my research question, and I think this is a research question that is of interest to this audience that has an interest in social capital, is how does social capital influence compliance with norms and dispute resolution in an egalitarian environment such as Wikipedia. And of course, because Wikipedia has a strong norm of equality, you would not expect differences in social capital to have a huge influence on compliance with norms, and you would expect it to be rather neutral. in terms of influence on dispute resolution. Wikipedia is on its face a space that rejects hierarchies, and as a consequence, social capital should not have an enormous amount of influence on the ways in which disputes arise and disputes are solved on Wikipedia. Now, when exploring this question, I moved on to look into some of the dominant theories of social capital. And my starting point was one of the very famous theories of social capital, that of James Coleman in the American Journal of Sociology in his article, Social Capital in the Creation of Human Capital, one of the most cited, article of sociology. And in this article, Coleman makes several claims. One of these claims is that social capital facilitates compliance with norms in a certain network. And of course, this is a very optimistic view of the impact of social capital on society. According to Coleman, in networks that have high levels of connections, high levels of social capital on a macro level, you see higher levels of compliance with social norms. So to give an example, and you can see on the right side of the slide, a kind of two figures that are taken from Coleman's paper. You see on the left network A, which is a network without closure. So you see that the network between A, B, C, D, and E is open-ended. So individual D and E are not connected with each other. That's why there is no closure of the network. On the right side, you see network B, and this is a closed network. And this is, of course, the language of Coleman, not mine. And you see that in network B, A, B, and C are all connected with each other. To give an example of Coleman's argument, imagine that D, I'm talking here about network A, and you see individual D. D is connected to B, but not to E, C, and A, okay? And you imagine that D breaches a norm of network A. According to Coleman, D is more likely to breach that norm because only B can retaliate against D. D only has one connection with one other member of the network. And for that reason, compliance, the breach of a norm is more likely than in network B, in the other network that is a closed network. So once again, let's consider the same example. And now we focus on individual A in network B. Now let's assume that A breaches a norm of network B. In that scenario, retaliation could come from two other individuals, B and C. So it is more likely that A will comply with the norm simply because the social pressure is stronger. So to come back to the general argument made by Coleman, when social capital is higher, according to him, it is more likely that individuals will comply with norms. Broadly speaking, because of social pressure that can be exercised onto those people. Now, interestingly, this argument was applied to Wikipedia. It was applied by two scientists, Piskorski and Gorbatai, in a paper, also at the American Journal of Sociology, titled Testing Coleman's Social Norm Enforcement Mechanism, Evidence from Wikipedia. And so the two authors in that paper argue that on Wikipedia, one can observe that editors who belong to a dense network are less likely to violate Wikipedia norms. And this is quite interesting because it seems to confirm this kind of positive account of social capital as set out by Coleman. As an important detail, Piskorski and Gorbatai focused in their paper on on the editing of content. They did not focus on conduct disputes in their paper. But they observed that when an editor belongs to a dense network, they are less likely, the content that they incorporate to Wikipedia is less likely to be changed by other editors. It is more likely to stick to the encyclopedia. But when I spoke to my informant as the preliminary stage of my research design, I had the impression from what he told me that the reality was slightly different, that in fact, those people who belong to dense networks on Wikipedia are less likely to be reverted, as they say on Wikipedia, which means their content is more likely to stick, not because they comply with norms, but because they're able to promote a certain content through the connections they have on the network. Now, we'll come back to that in more details later, but what it is interesting if you think in terms of theory before talking about the empirical data is that it seems to be more consistent with another theory of social capital. And that one is pessimistic when or realistic, I don't know, when Coleman's theory was more optimistic about the effects of social capital. And that is, of course, the theory of Pierre Bourdieu. And Pierre Bourdieu was one of the first sociologists or social scientists to really use the term social capital in the way we understand it today. Of course, you can see references made to social capital in the writings of Marx, but Marx used it in a very different way. Bourdieu was one of the first authors to really define social capital as we understand it today. And here is the way in which he defined social capital. And this definition can be found in many of his papers, but the one that I'm citing today is taken from his book with Loïc Vacan, An Invitation to Reflexive Sociology. So according to Bourdieu, social capital is the sum of the resources, actual or virtual, that accrue to an individual or a group by virtue of possessing a durable network of more or less institutionalized relationships of mutual acquaintance and recognition. This is a heavy definition, and we could spend probably 2 hours to unpack it. I would simply like to emphasize one aspect of that definition, which is the emphasis on resources. Social capital is the sum of the resources. For Bourdieu, and that is really key in understanding his thinking about social capital is a resource that strategic agents may use to promote their own interest and position in society. As with any other type of capital, whether it is human capital, financial capital, or what he calls symbolic capital, which is a more open-ended kind of category. In other words, social capital contributes to maintaining and reproducing elite domination of certain groups. People who belong to these groups will use their connections to support and promote their position in society. And Bourdieu gives concrete examples. For instance, in one of his papers, he gives the example of medical doctors, who are, clearly speaking, people who hold a certain amount of a position of relative power in society. And he explains how they use their social networks to promote this position, whether these are networks constituted through medical associations or congresses or alumni groups. So if we look at the work of the Arbitration Committee through the lens of a pessimistic theory of social capital, such as that of Bourdieu, we can really raise a hypothesis and ask the question of whether social capital can be used to prevail in disputes one has with other editors. And that is really the question that I became interested in. So I'll give you I will present some of my findings, and I will start with the quantitative findings. And I would probably say these are the least interesting findings because I'm not a statistician, so these are pretty basic findings. But what I've tried to do, and I'll try to explain it clearly, is to look at potential correlations between the levels of social capital and the stringency of the sanctions issued by the Arbitration Committee. So what you see on this figure in front of you are two measures of social capital, and I've used proxies to measure social capital. It was not easy to find an appropriate proxy, but here it doesn't really matter, I believe. So I've tried to look at the median social capital of people who were sanctioned by the Arbitration Committee, and I've tried to break it down by type of sanctions. So if you look at the rectangle, the black rectangle, you see 5 categories of sanctions: admonishment, interaction ban, usage restriction, topic ban, and Wikipedia ban. These sanctions are ranked from the least stringent to the most stringent. So in other words, on the left side, admonishment is almost nothing. It's a slap on the wrist, basically. The Arbitration Committee is telling you, bad boy, don't do it again. We don't want to see you again. On the right side of the rectangle, a ban is basically the harshest sanction. It is a death penalty. You're basically excluded from Wikipedia. What you see when you look at the median level of social capital for each of these sanctions, you see that people who get banned on Wikipedia have very low levels of social capital, whereas those who get admonished have much higher levels of social capital. So you see 44 and 192 for Wikipedia ban, and 491 and 2007 and 68 for admonishment. So it seems like, and I want to put a lot of nuance around this claim, it seems like editors with low levels of social capital are more likely to face harsher sanctions. So if you have low level of social capital, you're more likely to face a harsher sanction. You are more likely to be banned from Wikipedia. But of course, it doesn't say much about the impact of social capital on the resolution of dispute, because it could be interpreted in 2 different ways. It could mean that editors with low levels of social capital are less compliant with norms, which is basically Coleman's argument. It could mean, well, they face harsh sanctions because they breach the norms and then they get excluded from Wikipedia. Or it could mean, if we adopt Bourdieu's version, pessimistic version of social capital, that they face harsh sanctions because they are less able to defend themselves and they're less able to mobilize their networks in order to defend themselves. In order to answer this question, which one of these versions is true, I have resorted to a series of interviews, as I explained earlier, with some Wikipedia editors, members of the Arbitration Committee, and editors who had been involved in these disputes before the Arbitration Committee. So let me bring you to some of my findings. And I will basically today divide my findings in 2 categories. The findings based on interviews. The first findings concern what one could call digital social capital. What my interviewees told me is that even though Wikipedia is supposed to be an egalitarian space, a space of non-experts, a space where hierarchies do not matter, what you see, in fact, are new hierarchies that are specifically digital, that are specific to Wikipedia. So let's listen, for instance, to one former member of the Arbitration Committee who told me that there are two types of vested contributors on Wikipedia. There are people often autistic who devote every hour of their lives to Wiki, and these are not my words. And there are people who are highly articulate and contribute edits of a high quality. These are the unblockables. So here, this is an interesting quote because you see references to vested contributors. What is a vested contributor in a space that is supposed to be egalitarian and in the hands of non-experts? And who are these unblockables that this member of the arbitration committee is talking about? Another member of the arbitration committee gave me some clues on who are these unblockables. The unblockables are people who are indispensable but behave badly. So these are basically important people on Wikipedia. They are highly articulate, they contribute edits of a high quality, but because they are indispensable, they can breach norms, they can behave the ways they want, they can bully others, they can push their version of the truth while disregarding people who have less influence on the network. So I tried to kind of break into, this bubble of unblockables, and I tried to identify who they might be. And they were described to me as an aristocracy of Wikipedia, which again is fascinating when you think about the fact that it is supposed to be an egalitarian space. So this member of Wikipedia's aristocracy refused to speak with me directly, but accepted to exchange by email. And here is what this member told me or wrote to me. We're a tight clique of very long-standing editors, and none of our words find their way on the website. Again, the language is interesting, a tight clique of very long-standing editors. A tight clique seems to indicate that those people have very strong social capital. They are tightly connected with other editors who have great influence over the network. Another important aspect is that none of their words found their way on the website. Why is that the case? Because Wikipedia has norms against precisely against what they call canvassing, which is the fact that some editors gather their group in order to push their version of the truth on the website. Now, a lot of other interviewees told me basically the same thing. No one said anything different. One told me, and actually, paradoxically, this was a member of the arbitration committee, told me, I have pretty strong bonds and great respect for some editors, and I would not hesitate to defend them. And what was implied, of course, is if there is a dispute. Another one told me, if you're escalating a dispute, you have to find someone to support you. And again, someone else, people are arguing vociferously and try to gather the most support for their position. So what you see here is the strategic behavior of editors who try to use their influence on the network in order to prevail in the discussions concerning the resolution of these disputes. So we will see how these efforts might have an influence on the work of the arbitration committee. But at this stage, I would like to go back to this notion of digital social capital, because one aspect that was quite interesting to me when I discussed with these people, some of these very important people on Wikipedia with very high levels of social capital, I quickly realized that some of them, and I would even say most of those people, have great importance on Wikipedia, but little importance outside of Wikipedia. So their social capital that they build digitally on Wikipedia is quite different from their actual social capital outside of Wikipedia, which is quite interesting and something that I'd like to dig deeper into if I have time one day. So here is what matters. You see an egalitarian space that has its own hierarchies, and how people who have important networks on Wikipedia try to use these networks in order to prevail in disputes with others. Now, how does it work? Does it have an influence on the work of the arbitration committee? How do these people leverage their digital social capital to prevail in these disputes? So you can see on the right side of the slide, this is the outline of a judgment of the arbitration committee. And you can see different sections. And what is interesting to us, so it looks like a court judgment, by the way. I mean, you see the preliminary decision on jurisdiction, then you see the final decision, etc., etc. I've cut the outline because the screen is too small. What matters is the section preliminary statements. And you see a long list of statements from different people. You see these are their nicknames on Wikipedia. And you see that there are quite a few of those statements. This is the place, or one of the places, where networks matter, where people push for someone or against someone. So they would say, for instance, Florian is a great contributor. I've always worked very well with him. I love him. He's contributing so much to the encyclopedia. Please do not ban him from Wikipedia. Or they would say the opposite. They would say, I've had 10 years of experience on Wikipedia and I hate this guy. He cannot behave properly. He always insults the others. We cannot work with him. So you would believe that a dispute settler like the arbitration committee should not be open to this type of pressure. But it is, in fact, it seems to be quite influenced by this show of social force. For instance, a former member of ARBCOM told me, if enough people push in one direction, it is very hard for ARBCOM to go the other way. Here's what another one told me, which might explain why it is so hard for the members of the arbitration committee to go the other way when the crowd is shouting in the other direction. You might be more predisposed to assume good if they, the parties, have a long history of positive contributions. And how do they judge the long history of positive contributions? One accumulates social capital by being a good contributive editor. So in other words, if people come to your rescue, it probably means you're someone meaningful and important for the network. And because the network is based on the collaboration of editors, it means you're someone who can actually make changes on the encyclopedia and have a positive influence on the encyclopedia. That might be an underlying reason why social capital has such a strong influence on the outcome of disputes. Now, when I asked editors who had been sanctioned by the arbitration committee, they told me exactly the same. They told me, in my case, here is my citation, ARBCOM, which is the diminutive for arbitration committee, wanted to end the dispute and wanted the fight not to be happening. And it was easier to restrict one person, that editor who spoke to me, rather than 100. That is why I titled my paper Cancelling Disputes, because when you have an important disproportion of social capital, it is easier to sanction the weaker party because the impact on the social network is way less important than the other way around. Here's another one, another editor sanctioned by ARBCOM who told me, I just irritated people who have a lot of pull. You want to keep your head down when the aristocracy gets involved, which is actually quite scary when you think of the kind of egalitarian ethos of the network. Now, let me draw a few conclusions. The first interesting, I guess, conclusion is this idea of digital social capital and the fact that on Wikipedia, but I believe this is true of many other social networks online that assume equality, but in fact see, the rise of hierarchies within the network. All editors are equal, but some are more equal than others. There is an aristocracy on Wikipedia, and this aristocracy is able to shape the governance of the network, most importantly, its disputes in a certain direction. Now, this social capital allows well-connected individuals to avoid the consequences of their action, leading even to the cancellation of disputes and the concealment of their violations. So we see that in that case, even though it might be the case that people who belong to a dense network are more likely to comply with norms, when they breach those norms, they're also more likely to prevail in those disputes because they can gather the support of their friends. Now, you might think, okay, this is all very interesting, but this is about Wikipedia. What impact does it have on the real world? I think these conclusions about Wikipedia are, of course, specific to some extent because Wikipedia is a network that has particularly strong norms of collaboration. I think because the content of the encyclopedia is so dependent on the collaboration between editors, and because this collaboration is directly related to your capacity to connect to others, to have social capital in order to work with others, it is maybe more prone to prioritize individuals with higher levels of social capital. But you could also counter-argue that any human society is based on a certain level of collaboration. And then you could start thinking about a broader research agenda on the influence of social capital on the resolution of disputes within the court system. And this is, of course, something that legal sociologists have explored, but never completely fully. So they have, for instance, tracked the influence of hierarchies on court outcomes. And I'm thinking, for instance, of the famous landmark article by Mark Galenter, Why the Haves Come Out Ahead, which is an article where Galenter argues that people who have prominent positions in society are more likely to prevail in disputes. And he's particularly making the case for repeat players in the court system being more likely to prevail in those disputes than what he calls one-shotters, people who come only once, who are less influential. But the argument here is slightly different. I'm talking specifically about people who have high levels of social capital. How can it influence the outcome of court decisions? And I'm thinking particularly of criminal law. Well, simply because someone who is well-connected, someone who seems to have a positive influence on society is perhaps less likely to be sanctioned. And that's a fair assumption to make, and probably one that has to be explored in further research. So thank you very much for your attention. This is a reference of the paper if you're interested in looking at it. And I'm very happy to answer any of your questions. So I will stop sharing now, and I will give the floor back to Tristan.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Florian, for such an interesting presentation. Really fascinated when I read your paper about the way you laid out and you conducted this research so thoroughly, looking at the way in which social capital was measured and then applied to the way in which the disputes happened. And I think presenting the results as you have, it's a really compelling case for those two primary explanations, that one being the observance of norms and the other one being the potential use of social capital in order to get away with bad behavior, to use the way that perhaps I would describe it. So we'll take questions and discussion from the audience. Feel free to either raise your hand, which you can find under the reactions button within Zoom. Alternatively, you can post in the chat. If you don't want to read, unmute yourself and actually ask your question yourself, just make a note in the chat and I'll happily read the question out on your behalf. So while we're waiting for people to get organized, either raising their hands or posting in the chat, I thought I might ask a question of you, Florian, first, or a comment actually first. And that is that I think for me, the way in which you describe Pierre Bourdieu's understanding of social capital as resources, and again, this is the way I would describe what you said, not necessarily exactly the same language, as a resource that can be used, as the social influence that someone can draw upon to gain advantage for themselves. And it seems from the extensive reading of the literature that I've done that the word resources is probably the most poorly understood and poorly defined word that's associated with social capital. And the way you described, I think, is perfectly accurate of the way that I would understand Pierre Bourdieu's work. So I'm a little curious if you have any comments about the literature that you read and the wider understandings of the word resources, and how you came to navigate that literature, and whether you think there are different interpretations of that word.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you very much, Tristan, and thank you for your kind comments on the paper. So I've tried to review as much as I could of the literature on social capital, and the problem is there's so much to read, right? I mean, it's really a bit of a catch-all notion that is most of the time poorly defined and very hard to quantify. I can't recall, and I'm very intrigued by your own comments, having seen very deep discussions on this notion of resource. Except on the quantifying part. A resource is typically something that can be quantified, and it is very easy, for instance, to quantify financial capital. It might be easy to quantify human capital to a certain extent. It is very hard to quantify social capital. So how do you account for this type of resource? And that's one issue that I've faced in the research design. How do you quantify that resource? Is it the people you know, but then is it the number of people you know, or is it how influential the people you know are, and how do you account for that? So you could know two people, and these happen to be the most powerful people in your social system, in which case you would have a huge amount of social capital, and vice versa. You could know 1,000 people who are absolutely not influential, and you would have very poor social capital, although you know many people. So this is really an issue I faced. But on the term resource itself, I would be very interested in hearing more about this, and maybe we can exchange on this, unless you have some ideas that you'd like to share now of readings I could make. So yeah, so great question. I don't have a very satisfactory answer, I'm afraid, but I'm intrigued. Yes.
No, that's good. I'll say a few words now, but if you're interested in exploring more, perhaps at a later date, I'd be happy to do so. I think
Yes.
the comments I would make is that perhaps the most prominent scholar to pick up the idea of resources was Professor Nan Lin, who
correct.
Yeah, and so he'd already done, before coming to social capital, using the term social capital, he'd already done decades of work on social resource theory, and so he had a very well-developed theory. And my understanding of what he meant by resources was power and influence and prestige that one had access to through one's social contacts, through one's network. But somewhere along the lines, other ideas about resources slipped in. So perhaps more like assets, more like physical things that could be traded, information perhaps that could be mobilized or transferred across a network. And so the idea of influence and power and prestige that was originally in Pierre Bourdieu's work, and I think also in Nan Lin's work, slowly morphed and transformed to potentially include other things that we might actually define as human capital, information, knowledge, skills, expertise, and perhaps even physical capital. That if we can mobilize some items of equipment within a network, then perhaps that's what social capital is. And so we end up with a huge variety of different meanings to what the term resources potentially actually means in the context of social capital.
So this is interesting because you know the literature on social capital far better than I do, but I do remember reading critiques of social capital that go in that direction, in the sense that they argue that social capital is only a proxy for other types of capital, that it only carries other forms of capital, and as such, it is not a specific entity. So yeah, I do remember reading about this. I was not entirely convinced, to be honest, because I do think there is some even symbolic value in having a large network supporting your position. But I see the point of having other types of resources coming through that door. And these resources might belong to other categories of capital. Yeah.
Well, it's different, perhaps, interpretations of what social capital is. And the reason why I was complimentary of your research particularly is because I think you were true to Pierre Bourdieu's work and the meaning of resources as being that social influence, that power, that prestige that people can draw upon to get advantage. And your work is not confused by potentially these other meanings of resources that can get quite messy and complicated and potentially even contradictory. So I think you've done some really great research using a really solid meaning or definition of what social capital is, and I think you've produced some really fascinating results.
Thank
So
you.
if we move on, I haven't seen any other questions pop up from the audience, but perhaps while we're waiting to see if anybody has any, if you could just describe a little more how you measured social capital in your research.
So that was the tricky part. And maybe I can share again my screen.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, that was a difficult one, and probably a weakness of the research design, which doesn't bother me because the qualitative data is very clear and confirms, what the quantitative data seems to indicate. So you see there are two distinct measures. And I really didn't know. So I looked into different ways of measuring the networks on Wikipedia, but I faced those difficulties that I signaled earlier. It's very difficult to assess, the extent of those networks. So I asked a few of my interviewees as I was getting along, and particularly my informant, and I said, is there a place where I can trace those who have networks, who have this type of influence on Wikipedia? And of course, it's dangerous because people understand, and I realized that social capital in very different ways. So you have to be very clear when you ask people who belong to a certain network to do that for you. But that person told me, and I checked with a few other editors, and they confirmed that there are two, there is this data about each editor, which is available on Wikipedia. It's on a small tool called XTools, and you see different numbers there, and you see the number of edits that each editor makes to certain categories of discussion on Wikipedia. Of course, the fact that you edit a lot doesn't mean that you have high levels of social capital, although there is probably a correlation. But what my informants told me is that when you edit certain categories of discussions on Wikipedia, it is a pretty good indication you are an important member of that group. And these discussions are what they call Wikipedia talk. Wikipedia talk are not discussions about the content itself. These are discussions about the governance of Wikipedia. And those who have time to to do a lot of edits in these areas are typically these members of the aristocracy. These are the people who count. These are the people who have important networks on Wikipedia. So it is an unsatisfactory measure, of course, because it is only a proxy, right? But what is quite interesting is that I used two of these proxies, and what you see, which is fascinating, is that when you use one or the other of these proxies, you see very similar results, which seems to indicate that probably this is a good measure. But I would be, people who have a proper background in statistics and would probably be in a much better position to do this kind of work. But this is something I really did face, how to measure your social influence through your networks. But then the interviews were much clearer. I mean, it was very clear, you know, who is influential, not only in the sense of having many connections, but in the sense of having many meaningful connections. And there was really this idea of aristocracy, which is completely counterintuitive. When you think about it, Wikipedia was created to offer a response to scientific expertise in the traditional sense. So it rejects these types of hierarchies. It is based on a strongly egalitarian ethos. This is a place where non-experts can collaborate equally to produce content, and they are very proud, and I think rightly so, that their product is of a very high quality. But then you see within this network new hierarchies being formed, and hierarchies that are mostly based on this form of social capital.
Yeah,
So that's a long answer.
Yeah, no, I think the idea you had about particularly looking at the number of edits within the governance topics seems to be a pretty good proxy, because if you're involved sufficiently that you feel like you can understand the rules and have a say in the rules and have opinions about the rules, it probably indicates you're pretty well engaged and connected with the way in which the overall process works. So it seems like a pretty good proxy. I think there is a tendency for people in social capital research to simply look at broad numbers. You know, how many edits have you made? How many people do you know? How much contact do you have? And assuming that quantity is important. And I guess it's going to be correlated, because if you have a lot of quantity, chances are you have some degree of quality as well. But I think you've made that point pretty clearly, that it isn't necessarily the case, particularly because that's very well connected to the meaning of social capital that you've adopted. You know, that idea that it's influence, it's power, it's who you know, and it's how they're connected that's most important.
Yeah, and that's something I could have made even more explicit. I think when I think about it and I listen to you, I agree with what you're saying. I could have made it even more explicit. Yeah.
So we've got a question from Raymond in just a moment. There's also a question that's come through from YouTube as well for us to ask. So we'll get on to Raymond first. Feel free to unmute yourself, Raymond.
Okay, Dr. Grisel, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I just want to ask if there's any mechanism for ordinary people like me who disagree with the decisions of editors about because the behavioral disputes were settled by the aristocracy. This means the content was not revised, even if it was wrong. And I go to Wikipedia and complain. Is there a mechanism to hear from us ordinary Wikipedians to complain?
Yeah, Raymond. This is an excellent question, and this is, you're putting your finger on exactly the problem that is common on Wikipedia. If a powerful group of editors build content and you start arguing about this content with them, so you say, no, it's not true that, I don't know, something very controversial, and it happens on Wikipedia, okay? I'm not making it up. But you know, the classic, very controversial issues, let's say Israel-Palestine or the Shoah. I mean, this type of really, sensitive issues, I would say. So you're Raymond, you have no power on Wikipedia, okay? You just created your account 2 days ago and you say, hey, this is not true, you know, there were 6 million Jews who were killed during the Second World War and not, you know, something like that. And they say they will start arguing with you and they will push you to breach a norm of conduct. This is really the way it works. And then basically, because the groups are so powerful in front of you, you will be unable to change the content. So this is a major problem for Wikipedia. And there has been some literature recently on some areas of knowledge on Wikipedia. And these are these issues I was telling you about. These are the typical issues, you know, where some groups of editors have a political agenda. They are powerful because they have been on Wikipedia forever, and they achieve to push a certain version of the truth simply by using this social capital, by using their network. And when you're alone as an individual who is a newcomer, you will get pushed back by those people very strongly, and you'll be unable to change the content. So there is actually a very interesting paper that I enjoyed reading, and I am trying to find it right now, but I think I put it in a folder. These are historians, I believe from Canada, who wrote this fascinating article where they checked the content of one of those sensitive issues. And I think it was, I have such a poor memory because I read it 6 months ago, about the military operations of the German army in Poland during the Second World War. So you see these kind of issues where this is highly sensitive, okay? And they check the content because these are typically the kind of issues where highly politicized actors concentrate their efforts and achieve to push a certain version of the truth. So in that case, it was, according to these authors, to downplay the role of the German army in, you know, slaughtering civilian populations, etc., etc. And they found many mistakes. These historians, these professional historians, university professors, and they were able to track those mistakes to typically this type of mechanisms where newcomers would come in, step in and say, hey, but wait a second, this is not true. And then there was a whole mass of editors who were basically preventing them from changing the content and then being even able to prevail in disputes that would arise from those issues. So very interestingly, reflecting on my own experience on Wikipedia, my paper, I believe, raised some controversies on Wikipedia. And very interestingly, some people were, I believe, I can say that, strongly against it and criticized it very strongly. And others were very enthusiastic about it and very supportive. And interestingly, there seems to be, from what I've observed, a very clear divide between the supporters and those who were against it. And I would say that those who are against it are typically those who are the powerful embedded actors, very often men of a certain age with a certain level of education who have been on Wikipedia for a certain amount of time, were able to do that. And those who supported it are typically mostly more women who have a difficult time finding their way on Wikipedia because they don't have the same amount of power on the network. So it's a little bit of I'm kind of oversimplifying, you know, the dynamics here, but really I could notice that in my interactions with Wikipedians. So this is a very important point you're making, and I think it shows something that is very strong on Wikipedia, but might also exist in non-digital societies, you know, where a newcomer is trying to make some changes and is completely blocked, completely unable to promote changes, precisely because of the huge influence of those social resources employed by these insiders. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? That, you know, even in a social space where we try to make it egalitarian, we effectively start with a nice homogeneous base, but it very quickly we start to develop power differentials and structures and in groups and out groups and all sorts of things. And I guess that's the nature of what it means to be human and the way we've always constructed groups and societies. So
It is
perhaps,
yeah, sorry, just one point on this. I think this is probably the most troubling finding I've made in this research. Because Wikipedia is a fantastic project. It is so full of, you know, it's idealistic. It's a space where thousands of people are working for free. You know, I mean, that doesn't happen everywhere, right? I mean, in our world, you know, how many people just spend hours, you know, building knowledge for free that is available for everyone. So there is a very positive aspect to it. But as you said, Tristan, there is a very dark side to it, which is how an egalitarian space that comes from a very idealistic place transform into, honestly, sometimes something that I found at times rather scary. And really, you speak to these people, and they're very like, in the editors, they all tell you about this kind of space that is extremely challenging for them, and it is quite troubling. And I cited, I referred to Animal Farm, and it really reminded me of this, you know, a space that starts, you know, from a place of egalitarianism and good hopes, and then in the end you end up in a dictatorship, you know, and that's probably not exactly the right analogy, but there are some interesting parallels to make.
yeah, and perhaps this wasn't part of your research, but maybe you observed some things along the way that we tend to see quite often, power and influence and prestige being communicated through symbols. So, you know, for someone in business, it might be the really expensive watch. For someone who's in a gang, it might be a tattoo or certain types of clothing. But perhaps in this digital space, is there something about the language, the terminology that's used, or perhaps it's the knowledge of the rules that ends up being the symbol of power and influence within that space?
Absolutely. So you're putting your finger on another very interesting thing you can observe on Wikipedia. Wikipedia has developed its own symbols of power, but insiders know what these symbols are. So and that's how they would immediately identify that Raymond is an outsider, because he would not master those little symbols. So there is one that I learned about, and I may have mentioned that in my paper, I don't remember. But apparently, I didn't know that, but there's a specific way of signing your edits on Wikipedia. Like I don't know, / something, you know, I have no idea. But there is something, and we would never know that unless you're an experienced editor, unless you know that the importance of that symbolic meaning. So Raymond would write, this is not true, and then not put this signal. And then everyone would know, oh, Raymond is an outsider. Okay, good luck. Then you, so this is the knowledge of these rules. And many people told me that these rules are incredibly sophisticated. There's so many little rules that you need to know on how to do things, where to do them. So this is the more sophisticated part. And of course, there are also symbols that are more obvious. So for instance, the number of edits, you know, what I said earlier, is a good proxy. So editors are fighting to have more edits. So I remember speaking to one editor who was very proud to have a certain number of edits. I'm not going to say how many because I wanted to keep it confidential. But when I talked to him, he said, yeah, I'm one of the most prolific editors on Wikipedia. I've done X number of edits. And clearly it was a currency for him. It was a symbol of his importance on the network. And then there is a third symbol that is quite important. And these are the Wikipedians give each other stars of influence. And you can see on their profile. So there is they call them the Barn Stars of the best editor, etc. And so they exchange those signs of recognition. And so you know who is kind of important by looking at these kind of prizes, and they're proud of them. You know, for them, it's an important sign of belonging.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So there is a
it's
question
important.
on the YouTube channel. Let's get to that one. Lex is asking about how to measure digital social capital and corporate sustainability, and whether you have any ideas about that. Perhaps Lex can pick up some ideas from the way in which you've described measuring digital social capital, because I guess it depends on the context. And one other comment I'd say is that the International Social Capital Association is running free research design and methods sessions. There's actually one this week on Thursday. So Lex is welcome to come along to those, and perhaps you could explore a little bit more about how you might go about measuring social capital. But Florian, if you have any thoughts about measuring digital social capital in corporate sustainability.
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer. So first of all, there is something very important about digital social capital, which I found, I said that earlier, but very intriguing, which is its disconnection with social capital offline in the real world. So in other words, you can be someone very important on the digital space and someone who is not really important outside of the digital space. And I've seen that again and again and again. The digital space provide a place where people can redefine their identities, find a second life. I mean, that's you know that's pretty obvious, and they do. So I remember interviewing someone who was a very important editor on Wikipedia, and usually Wikipedians, they're not too keen on telling you who they are in their life. But this one told me, and he told me, I'm delivering pizza. He's spending 10 hours a day on Wikipedia, and then in the evening, to just make a living, he goes 2-3 hours to deliver pizza. On Wikipedia, he's a king. He's a very important person. Outside of Wikipedia, he's delivering pizza. I mean, there's nothing wrong with delivering pizza, but you can see the kind of disconnect there. So going back to the question, that's something to keep in mind. Okay, someone who is important outside of the online space might not be important online, and vice versa. Then how to track the importance digitally? It is very difficult. I don't have a kind of generic answer. I would say it depends on the network. So for instance, on X or Twitter, I would probably measure it in a completely different way from what I've done on Wikipedia. But it has to be a very specific design. So I would encourage you to attend those sessions that Tristan was mentioning, because I'm not able to give you a very good answer, unfortunately, and I apologize for that.
And part of the reason, of course, is, like you mentioned, it's relevant to the context within which you're measuring it, and it's also relevant to the definition or meaning of social capital that you're adopting. You know, as we discussed, the approach that you adopted is very tangible and specific, but there are other meanings out there, which would mean that, of course, you would need to measure social capital differently if that were the case. So we still have a little bit of time if anybody has any final questions. Get in now if you do have any final questions. There's one more thing I wanted to ask you about, which is we can see within society the way in which powerful people do tend to get away with a little bit more, whether it's because they can afford to hire the really good lawyers, or because they have more power and influence, and people are a little less reluctant to punish them for the things that their misactions that they've undertaken. So I guess thinking about how the structures within society that we use, is there scope to apply any of those to Wikipedia beyond, of course, the existing arbitration committee that you've described in your research?
Sorry, Tristan, can you say that again? Are you asking, are there any other traces of this on Wikipedia, or are there any other ways in which we can try to use that case study and apply it beyond Wikipedia? I had a moment.
I'm actually thinking the other way around. Like you've described a situation in Wikipedia it has a lot of positives, but there's also some downsides as well. Within society and our legal system within society, there are perhaps different mechanisms to hold people to account and to deal with people who are not observing laws and norms and so forth. So is there anything about society's systems that we might be able to apply to Wikipedia beyond what's already there, which is the arbitration committee that you described?
To solve those issues or to make it better, or
to make it better, like if there are in-groups and powerful people who can do bad things.
So it's interesting. That's a very good question. So first of all, I would say that, I mean, I finished on this, but then I will answer your question. What we see on Wikipedia is probably an extreme version of the influence of social capital on what I call cancellation of disputes, or the fact that powerful people get away with what they did wrong. But I believe we can see traces of the same mechanisms in legal systems. Beyond what you mentioned, Tristan, which is, okay, powerful people can hire the best lawyers. Okay, that's obvious. They have more money, they can do that. But beyond that, there are some mechanisms that are embedded in our legal systems that give a little bit of leeway to people who are influential. And I'm thinking, for instance, of something that I believe is disappearing progressively, but still exists, which are character witnesses.
Yeah.
So there are examples like that where people, and I remember that was the case of Jimmy Savile. I don't know if you're aware of that case in the UK, where this famous TV host was accused and I believe condemned for pedophilia, or I don't remember exactly. I don't want to say something wrong, but that was pretty bad. And the problem is this person was so well connected that he could bring basically the Pope as a character witness. I mean, I'm not joking, and of course it had a lot of influence during the trials, because the jury was facing someone who could bring, the most influential figures in the world to his rescue. And that is something that signals exactly what is happening on Wikipedia. I am important. Important people believe I should not be condemned. And I'm so fundamental to this society that I should get away with it, even if I've done something wrong, And that is the mechanism that is, I think, at play in any legal system. And in fact, lawyers always use that by saying, my client is a good person. Most often he has a foundation that is, treating such disease in Africa. So yes, of course, he breached a very important contract and he behaves like an asshole, but he's also doing good in other parts of the world, very influential. I mean, that might be a little different from social capital, actually, but you see where I'm heading. So in any case, looking at it the other way around, which is what you were asking for, there is still something very important in most of our legal systems, which doesn't exist on the Arbitration Committee. And I think if the Arbitration Committee were minded to improve their processes, I would suggest they do that, which is the notion of due process. There is no due process before the Arbitration Committee. It doesn't recognize the notion, and that is the core of the issue, due process. How do you make sure that a person has a fair trial? Why is it the case that the Arbitration Committee is not, sensitive to this? I think it has to do with the nature of Wikipedia. Wikipedia doesn't want to be a system that is governed in a legalistic way. It doesn't want to have processes that are judicialized. It wants to keep its DNA as a kind of collaborative effort that exists in a different space, right? But I believe that sooner or later, and I think it has already started, this space is going to be judicialized progressively by importing some notions of due process, of constitutional values, in order to ensure that, things are done fairly. So yeah, so that's where, the influence can go the other way around.
I think that's a great answer, and I assumed it would have something to do with the original values of Wikipedia as being egalitarian, that without wanting to create hierarchies and power structures within Wikipedia, you would be reluctant to establish those kinds of authorities that can then enforce due process and so forth. And so you end up with a free rein for people who want to effectively do the wrong thing and break those norms and generate a lot of power, but the only resolution seems to be to create the hierarchy, at least to some extent.
Absolutely. And at the moment, I'm doing a research project on something else that is happening at the moment on Wikipedia, which is the creation of a universal code of conduct. And that is exactly this dynamic of creating some kind of constitutional norms in order to be able to operate this system. And as one could expect, there is a lot of pushback within the network because this is an element of hierarchy. This is an element of governance that is akin to one you would find in a legal system.
Yeah. So Raymond has the privilege of the last question or comment. Over to you, Raymond.
I think there's a comment on the chat box to give the person another chance.
There are a couple of comments there. I'm not sure they're questions, though. So everyone can feel free to read them. But over to you, Raymond.
Okay. Now that you mentioned your proposed revisions to the rules of the game, perhaps a very big way to improve the system is to rotate editors, with selection of editors, and also to try to diversify the profile of editors. Like you were saying something about certain maybe men or of certain education, type of education. I don't know if nationality is also involved. This set of editors are they coming from a specific type of maybe Europe or America or Canada, whatever, or maybe
Absolutely.
country, or maybe age group, or maybe school. So maybe the selection process for editors should be diversified in terms of many factors, and maybe they should be evaluated in terms of how many complaints are coming in or whatever. Yes, to just to minimize, but I don't think you can really eliminate that. It's human nature. Very difficult to do that.
So you're absolutely right, Raymond. I think there is a problem of homogeneity. And as you said, these are people from certain parts of the world with a certain level of education of a certain gender. That's very clear. And I think there are studies about this. I'm not making it up. This is itself very controversial to say on Wikipedia. There is a lot of pushback against this kind of discourse, but I think it's the truth. The problem is there is no selection procedure for editors. It's all very fluid, because it's a space for non-experts. So then how do you become part of the group of experts? I mean, there are different ways. It is mostly by spending an inordinate amount of time on Wikipedia, which itself self-select a certain type of people. So older people very frequently, or younger ones who have time to be, spending 10 hours a day on Wikipedia. So it's not easy to diversify a very organic type of community that is not selected in a way that is very clear. It's more of a process of self-selection that takes a bit of time. What I can say with certainty is that someone like me, who is an outsider, who has relatively little knowledge of Wikipedia, would not survive 2 days on Wikipedia. That's very clear. So you can imagine, and I'm an educated man, I mean, clearly I have tools to defend myself, but that tells you a lot about, how someone who doesn't have these privileges would fare. But it doesn't mean that, for instance, someone who is uneducated could not be able to be influential on Wikipedia. And very often, as I said, we see interesting mechanisms of disconnection between what happens in your life and what happens on Wikipedia. It does, and that's the beauty of the project, and that's also why I'm very drawn to this project. It is also a space that redefines hierarchies. It doesn't eliminate hierarchies, it redefines them. But these are still hierarchies, and they're sticky. They are hard to beat. Yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating. I can think of so many other research projects you could conduct and other things to look at. Fascinating space. So thanks very much, Florian, for this presentation. We really appreciate you taking the time and effort to give it. So thanks on behalf of everybody. For everybody, our next session, of course, is the research design session this Thursday with Dr. Beverly Sloan. And we have a fascinating webinars coming up. We have one by Professor Dimitri Williams on social value. We have another one on the effects of social capital in young people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And we also have one on social capital and financial reporting as well. And there's more will be announced shortly. So check out details on the website. If you haven't already, feel free to join the association. We'd love to have everybody involved. Yeah, we're doing great things, and hope you can get involved and contribute to it. So thanks very much, Florian.
Thank you very much. Have a very nice evening or day, everyone. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, Dr. Grisel.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.